Part 1 Naruto is a series that is well respected in high regard from the Naruto community, but when it comes to Part 2 Naruto or Shippuden in the anime, there isn't as much praise as compared to Part 1. One of the more popular opinions about Naruto is that it stops being about ninjas when it goes to Part 2, or that the series falls off after the pain arc, or the series should have ended at the pain arc. Part 2 Naruto also gets criticized by fans by saying it only focuses on Naruto chasing after Sasuke, and it forgets about all the other side characters that were introduced to in Part 1. However, I can't say I agree with any of these points because I feel that Naruto Part 2 has done a lot more good, and I also feel that a lot of the good that comes from Part 2 are often overlooked since people would always try to focus on the issues, or they try to make cases on why Part 1 was written better. Whether Part 2 Naruto is better than Part 1 or not is down to your opinion. I'm just making this video to talk about why Part 2 deserves more appreciation, and to hope by the end of this video you might respect it a little bit more. So one of the biggest criticisms that Part 2 Naruto often faces is that it strays away from his ninja type strategic fights, and instead focuses on more of the Dragon Ball Z type fights with chakra beams or explosions, and undergoes a massive power creep as the series progresses. This criticism never really made much sense because literally in the first chapter of the series, we're already aware of the Nine Tails, which is a tail beast that could destroy villages and cities with ease. So we're already aware of these high-level creatures in the Naruto-verse. Literally, in the Konoha Crush arc, we see a kaiju battle between Gamabunta and Shukaku in the forest. But for some reason, when we see these types of fights in Naruto Part 2, that's when it becomes a problem. And also, the statement about there being no strategy in Part 2 is very false because most fights in Part 2 involve strategy in their fight, especially during the 4th Ninja War, which is the arc where people mainly say the fights become more like Dragon Ball Z. In the Kazekage Rescue arc, Gaara vs Deidara, Kankura vs Sasori, Naruto and Kakashi vs Fake Itachi, and Sakura and Chiyo vs Sasori all have strategy in their fights where they use their jutsu to counter each other and also to find out the weaknesses in their jutsu. In the Akatsuki Suppression arc, Shikamaru vs Hidan was very strategic, like when he used Kakuzu's blood to trick Hidan into thinking he was using Shikamaru's blood to perform the ritual. Kakashi vs Kakuzu also has strategy when he tried to figure out how Kakuzu's 5 hearts worked, and had to use his knowledge of chakra natures to counter them by looking at the hand signs that Kakuzu was weaving. Naruto landed the Rasen Shuriken on Kakuzu through his use of shadow clones to outsmart him, which delivered the final blow. Sasuke vs Deidara was also very strategic, and is probably one of, if not the most strategic fight in the Naruto series, because of how Sasuke was using his Sharingan and his knowledge of chakra natures to counter Deidara's Earth release with his lightning release. Even the fight between Sasuke and Itachi was also strategic as well, because of how Sasuke used heat from Itachi's Materasu, and even using his Dragon Flame Jutsu to change the weather in order to create more lightning, instead of using his own chakra. Pretty much all the fights in the Pain arc were also strategic as well, especially Naruto vs Pain. Yes, there was a slugfest when Naruto gained 6 tails, but the 9 tails has always been in the series since the beginning, and the 6 tails fight was only a small portion of that fight. Most of that fight has strategy involved. In the 5 Kakesame arc, Sasuke vs Danzo was very strategic because of how Sasuke was trying to counter Danzo's Izanagi by putting him in Genjutsu to make him think that the time limit was longer than it actually was for him to use his Izanagi. And even though the 4-4 was known by fans for straying away from his strategic fights, there was still a lot more strategy than people think. For example, each division in the Shinobi Alliance had their own specific tasks, such as the Long Range Division, the Close Range Division, the Mid Range Division, the Sealing Corps, and the Medical Corps and the Sensory Division. There were parts in the war where some divisions had to meet up with each other to offer support in order to deal with the reanimated Shinobi and the White Setsu, and these were decided by the Intelligence Division led by Shikaku. Kabuto was also using strategy during the war by making the White Setsu absorb chakra from the Shinobi Alliance during the day, and then during the night they would transform into whoever they stole the chakra from in order to cause distrust between the allied ninja to destroy them from within. These are examples of war strategy in the first part of the arc, and the fight still has strategy, like Dari and Team 10 vs Kinkaku and Ginkaku, Naruto, Killer Bee and Itachi vs Nagato, Naruto vs the 3rd Raikage, and Gaara vs the 2nd Mizukage. As the arc goes on, we still see more strategy in the fights, like Kakashi Guy and Naruto vs Obito, when they tried to figure out how his Kamui worked, and by outsmarting him, Naruto was able to break his mask. When the 10 Tails was unleashed, Shikaku devised a plan to make use of the allied Shinobi Force Jutsu to entrap the 10 Tails and allowing the mid-long range ninja to attack Madara and Obito on top of the 10 Tails. Even when Obito became the 10 Tails Jinchuriki, there was still strategy being utilized in the fight from Minato, Tobirama and Naruto when he was using Sage Jutsu to counter Obito since natural energy was his weakness. When you go to the fights with 10 Tails Madara and Kaguya, which are at the end of the arc, strategy was still being shown in those fights, like Naruto and Sasuke trying to deal with Madara's Limbo clones, or Team 7 devising the plan to seal Kaguya through the use of Naruto's clones, his transformation jutsu and Sasuke's Rinnegan ability. Sakura appearing from the air was also part of the plan, and this caught Kaguya off guard, and that led to her being sealed. It was not just down to beating her in a slugfest or through the use of massive explosions or chakra beams to seal her. They sealed her by working together and outsmarting Kaguya, which was the very first lesson Kakashi taught Team 7 from the Bell test. So even during the war arc, which was the final arc in Part 2, there was still a lot of strategy involved in the fights, which have been massively overlooked and don't receive as much credit as the fights do in Part 1. Even in Part 1, not every fight was highly strategic, and some were just based on hand-to-hand combat on being more brawl-focused. Gaara vs Rock Lee is one of the more popular and loved fights in Naruto, and for great reason. However, the fight does not have that much strategy in it, because most of it was Rock Lee trying to break through Gaara's sand through sheer willpower and breaking past his limits when he opened the 5th gate. Naruto vs Sasuke at the final valley in Part 1 is probably the best Naruto fight of all time. but again, it does not have that much strategy in the fights compared to the other ones. It was mostly hand-to-hand combat and both of them beating each other to death, and not them trying to counter each other's jutsu or outsmarting each other during the fight. The same thing applies to Part 2. Iconic fights like Kakashi vs Obito, Naruto vs Sasuke Part 2, Madara vs Shinobi Alliance, and even Minecraft vs Madara. All these fights are fan favourites and are well loved in the community, but these fights don't have that much strategy in their fights either, yet they still manage to captivate the viewers. So this statement about Part 2 Naruto losing his identity with his fights, or being less about ninjas, doesn't make much sense because in the Naruto franchise, from Part 1 you've always had strategic fights, and also fights that just relied on like brawl fights or beating each other to death in hand-to-hand combat. So one major thing that I feel that people tend to overlook when they criticize Part 2 and compare it to Part 1 are the villains. Naruto is well known for having a roster of great villains throughout the series, including Part 2. In Part 1, you had villains like Zabuza, Orochimaru, the Sound 5 and Gaara, who are well respected in the community, but the villains in Part 2 I feel that are even better than them. In Part 2, they had villains like Pain, Obito, Madara, Kabuto, Kaguya, Sasuke and the Akatsuki. Pain, Obito and Madara are regarded as the best villains in Naruto, and some might argue that they might be some of the best villains in all of anime and manga because of the impact that they have in their series. You had villains like Pain and Obito who served as like thematic foils to Naruto, in that they gave into hatred, which is the opposite of Naruto as a character who overcame his hatred, or Madara being built up for hundreds of chapters since Part 1, which led to him having one of the best villain introductions when he faced off against the Shinobi Alliance. Kabuto went from being Orochimaru's sidekick in Part 1 to being one of the main villains of the war arc, and we even get to see more of his backstory and why he is so fixated on finding his identity. Even Kurama, he gets more depth and development in Part 2. We find out about his connection with the Sage of the Six Paths along with the other tail beasts. We actually learn that his real name is Kurama instead of just being labelled as the Nine Tails, and we get to see why he has so much hate for humans. Seeing him finally team up with Naruto in the war is one of the best moments in the war arc because Naruto wanted to treat the tail beasts as friends rather than tools. I know Itachi isn't a villain, but in Part 2 we learn more about him as a character as well, and why he did the things that he did in order to protect Sasuke in the village, and this made Itachi one of the most beloved characters in the Naruto fandom because of what we learned from him in Part 2. If we compare the Sound 5 to the Akatsuki as villain organizations, the Akatsuki were better written, more unique, and they mattered more to the story than the Sound 5 did, and all these villains came from Part 2, but people tend to forget about them when they hate on Part 2 or don't give it the credit that it deserves for having so many great villains. Another main criticism that people have in Part 2 Naruto is that they claim that Part 2 only focuses on Naruto and Sasuke, and that every other character was just tossed to the side. However, I think this is far from the truth because there are a lot of other characters that had their time to shine in Part 2, and it wasn't just down to Sasuke and Naruto. The characters that people mainly talk about that get sidelined in Part 2 are Rock Lee and Neji in particular, because of the amount of screen time they had in Part 1. Yes, they do a lot less in Part 2, but they're not the only characters in the series. Sakura does a lot more in Part 2 than she does in Part 1. She has her own fight against Sasori and was also important in the Tenjin mission. She was also very important in the war arc because of her medical abilities, which was stated to have surpassed Tsunade's when she unlocked her Byakugo seal. You get a lot more focus on the previous Hokage in Part 2 as well, since in Part 1 they were only shown very briefly, besides Hiruzen, but in Part 2 you learn more about them and their backstories, and they were also very important in the fight against Obito and Madara in the 4th war. My guy also does a lot more in Part 2 compared to what he does in Part 1. In Part 1, he only has one short fight against Kisame and an emotional moment with Lee, but in Part 2 he has a fight with the fake Kisame at the beginning of the Kazekage rescue arc, and he also has a fight against Kisame at the Waterfall of Truth where he opens the 7th gate. He helps in the fight against Obito as well, and the Tail Beasts, and against Madara where he opens the 8th gates, which was definitely his biggest moment in the entire series. He also gets backstory as well, which explains why he's so hardworking because of his dad being a massive inspiration to him. Kakashi as well, in Part 2 he gets more focused on his past and he does more in the story. In Part 1, Kakashi does do a lot of course, but in Part 2, that's where you get to see more of his backstory, and you see his relationship with Obito and him finding out that he was Obito behind the mask, which was such a big moment for his character. In Part 1, he fights Zabuza, Kabuto and Itachi, but in Part 2, he fights against Pain, Kakuzu, reanimated Zabuza, Kaguya and Obito twice. He was also involved in the chase against Deidara in the Kazekage rescue arc when he uses the Kami for the first time, and he was also quite an important character in the 5 Kage Summit arc when he faces off against Sasuke. In Part 2, we also learn more about the characters from other villages like the Cloud Village and the Sand Village, and we're also introduced to the samurai like Mifune who gets a fight against Hanzo in the war. We also get to see what the other 5 Kage could do, because in Part 1 we only saw what the third Kage could do, but in Part 2 we see all the other Kage have fights, especially against Madara. Shikamaru literally takes center stage in the Akatsuki suppression arc, and seeing him learn about what it means to protect the king, which basically means protecting the next generation of ninja. Inu and Choji also get more moments in Part 2 during the war arc, like Choji getting over his cowardice of being too nice when he fought against reanimated Asuma, and then facing against the Gedo statue with his new butterfly mode they achieved without using the pills, and Inu relaying messages to every allied shinobi and taking over a dad who died along with the Intel division. Gaara himself still gets a lot to do, and develops more as a character throughout the series, by overcoming his hatred as Kazekage, confronts Sasuke's hatred at the Hokage summit, and even has an emotional moment with his father in the war about him always being loved by his mother, and even sees Sukage as a comrade, despite him being the reason that Gaara was hated as a child. Hinata as well, she also has more moments in Part 2, In part 1, her biggest moment was her standing up to Neji in the Chunin exams, but in part 2, she has moments like standing up to Pain and confessing her love to Naruto, and in the war, she stops Naruto from joining Obito after the death of Neji. Naruto was close to falling into despair and giving up, but it was Hinata who drove Naruto out of it and brought him back to reality, and this led to Naruto giving his chakra to the allied shinobi and continues to fight for the sake of the world. So even though part 2 doesn't do much for characters like Lee and Neji or Shino, it still introduces us to more characters who are more important to the main story, and even gave the characters in part 1 more depth and more involvement in the story. Not every character in the story has to be prevalent throughout the entire story, and that's probably why Kishimoto didn't need to involve Neji and Lee in part 2 as much, because their character arcs were already wrapped up in part 1, so they didn't need to be too prevalent throughout part 2. But instead, in part 2, we got more characters that were introduced to the story, and they were more important as well, and even most of the characters that we were introduced to in part 1, they got a lot more to do in part 2 compared to part 1. Another thing that people like to bring up when they talk about part 2 Naruto is that it was only about Naruto chasing after Sasuke. Yes, the main reason why Naruto and Sakura trained during the time skip was so they can become strong enough to bring Sasuke back. But to say that part 2 was only about Naruto chasing after Sasuke for like 500 episodes or something crazy like that is just very wrong, since only a few arcs mainly focus on going after Sasuke. The Kazekage rescue arc was about saving Gaara and facing off 2 Katsuki members. Sasuke wasn't even mentioned in that arc until after the Sasori fight. The Tenchi Bridge arc is definitely the arc that focused on going after Sasuke. The Akatsuki suppression arc was mainly Shikamaru's arc. It had nothing to do with Sasuke besides him being Naruto's motivation to complete the Rasen Shuriken. But for the most part, it was about Team 10 and their revenge on Hidan and Kakuzu. The battle between brothers arc was Sasuke focused, and though there was a Sasuke rescue squad formed by Team 7 and Team 8, the main focus of that arc was about Sasuke forming his own team to go after Itachi. The stuff with Team 7 and Team 8 meeting up with Kabuto and Tobi was only secondary to the main plot of the arc. The Jiraiya vs Pain arc was mainly about Jiraiya. It had nothing to do with Sasuke. It focused on Jiraiya and his former students. The Pain of Salt arc was mainly about Naruto avenging Jiraiya's death and Naruto trying to find his answer to true peace during his talk with Nagato. Sasuke wasn't even mentioned during that whole attack on the Leaf Village. The 5 Kage arc did involve Naruto going after Sasuke, but it wasn't the whole plot of the arc. The main plot was about the 5 Kage meeting up with each other and forming the Shinobi Alliance to fight against Obito, who just declared war on them. Sasuke going after Danzo was definitely one of the highlights of the arc as well, and the Team 7 reunion only comes at the end of the arc, and all Naruto and Sasuke did was just clash and talk for a bit. It wasn't the main plot of the arc. The 4th Ninja War arc was about preventing Obito from reawakening the Ten Tails. Naruto doesn't even enter the war until later on with Killer Bee, and even then, going after Sasuke wasn't on his mind. He wanted to join the fight because he didn't like the fact that people were losing their lives over his protection. Sasuke doesn't even enter the war until like halfway through anyways, and taking down Kage, Madara and Obito were the main goals of the arc at the time. It was only until after they defeated Kaguya that we finally get to see the Naruto and Sasuke rematch at the Final Valley, which was their first major fight since the end of part 1. So out of all the arcs in part 2, only one of them was fully focused on chasing after Sasuke, but a few others involved Naruto going after Sasuke only a little bit. Yes, Naruto going after Sasuke is one of his final goals, but it wasn't the main focus of part 2, it was just the end goal. It's no different to his goal of becoming Hokage, since all of Naruto is not just about him becoming Hokage, there is a lot more to the story. There are other characters that got focus and had impact on the story as well. So part 2 Naruto I feel is quite overhated and deserves as much credit as part 1 does, because it still has the same strategic ninja fights we love from part 1, focuses on a lot of characters other than Naruto and Sasuke, with 2 of them having arcs of their own, has more to his story than just Naruto going after Sasuke, and gave his villains I think are better and more memorable than the villains from part 1.